Imagine walking into a place you built with your bare hands, only to find it ruled by betrayal, deceit, and toxic power. What would you do if the very values you fought for were being torn apart? This is the story of Evelyn Harper, a woman who faced the ultimate betrayal and turned it into a fight for justice, redemption, and the heart of her legacy. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Charleston, South Carolina, basked in the warm glow of the holiday season. The cobblestone streets were lined with gas lanterns flickering against the chill of December. Strings of white lights adorned every window, and the faint sounds of Christmas carols filled the air as a street musician strummed an acoustic guitar near the riverfront. The city was alive with the spirit of celebration, and nowhere was this more evident than along East Bay Street, home to some of the most luxurious restaurants in town. Among them stood the Magnolia House, a historic building repurposed into a high-end dining establishment. Its tall, arched windows revealed glimpses of a refined interior, crystal chandeliers, linen-draped tables, and a crowd of impeccably dressed patrons. The faint clinking of glasses and soft murmur of conversation hinted at the kind of exclusivity only reserved for Charleston's elite. Inside, the restaurant's atmosphere exuded polished sophistication. Hosts in tailored suits welcomed guests with warm smiles, leading them past arrangements of fresh lilies that perfumed the air. Servers glided between tables with precision, balancing plates of lobster bisque and perfectly seared duck breast. Every detail, from the ambient lighting to the background notes of a live jazz trio, was curated to perfection. Evelyn Harper approached the entrance of the Magnolia House with measured steps. She wore a simple coat, slightly frayed at the edges, and carried a worn leather purse that hinted at its many years of service. Her gray curls were tucked neatly beneath a woolen hat, and her understated demeanor could easily allow her to blend into the crowd of holiday shoppers on the street. Yet beneath the modest exterior was a woman who had weathered storms far more daunting than the cold. Years ago, Evelyn had built a life many could only dream of. As the founder of a thriving restaurant empire, she had spent decades carving out spaces where food, community, and equality coexisted harmoniously. But tonight, she wasn't here to bask in success. She was here undercover, responding to whispered concerns that the Magnolia House had strayed from the values she held dear. Pushing open the heavy wooden door, Evelyn stepped into the warmth of the restaurant. The stark contrast between the winter chill outside and the glowing ambiance inside was palpable. She paused for a moment to take it all in, her sharp eyes scanning the room for subtleties others might overlook. At the front desk, a young hostess greeted her with a polite, if slightly distracted smile. "Good evening. Do you have a reservation?" she asked, her tone professional but impersonal. "No, I don't," Evelyn replied, her voice steady and calm. "But I was hoping you might have a table for one." The hostess hesitated, glancing at a seating chart before casting a quick, assessing glance at Evelyn's coat and purse. "Let me check," she said, her words wrapped in thinly veiled skepticism. As the hostess disappeared into the dining room, a tall man in his early 30s approached the podium. Ethan Myers, the restaurant's manager, exuded the kind of confidence that often bordered on arrogance. His tailored blazer, polished shoes, and perfectly styled hair suggested a man deeply invested in appearances. Ethan's sharp eyes landed on Evelyn, taking in her attire with a flicker of disdain. He leaned toward the hostess and murmured something that drew a hesitant nod from her. Then, with a practiced smile, he turned to Evelyn. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Ethan began, his tone dripping with condescension. "But we're fully booked this evening. Reservations are required for a table here." Evelyn looked at him evenly, her expression calm but unwavering. "I see," she said slowly, her voice soft yet deliberate. "I imagine a place like this must have a very clear policy for accommodating walk-ins?" Ethan's smile tightened. "We do," he replied, glancing toward the list in front of him that he hadn't bothered to check. "Unfortunately, given the nature of our clientele, it's rare that we have open tables, especially for someone without a reservation." His eyes darted briefly to the edges of her coat, the worn leather of her purse, and the scuffs on her boots. The implication in his words was as loud as a shout. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "I see," she repeated, but you haven't actually looked to see if there's a table available. Ethan straightened, the fake smile plastered on his face, now accompanied by a flicker of annoyance. With all due respect, ma'am, I don't need to check. I know my dining room. He gestured vaguely toward the bustling restaurant behind him, where at least two empty tables sat plainly in view. Evelyn shifted her gaze past him, noting the unoccupied seats. She turned back to Ethan, her voice calm and steady. Perhaps you should take a closer look. You might be surprised at what you find. Ethan let out a short, dismissive laugh. I'm sure you mean well, but this is a fine dining establishment. We have a certain standard here. It's important to maintain the ambiance. His gaze lingered pointedly on her coat. Sometimes it's just not the right fit. From across the podium, a young server named Lila Brooks watched the exchange with growing discomfort. Barely into her 20s, Lila had been working at the Magnolia House for a year, long enough to know Ethan's tendencies. She recognized the condescension in his voice, the way he so easily dismissed people who didn't meet his superficial standards. Lila adjusted the tray of drinks balanced on her hand, her brow furrowing as she listened. She wanted to step in, to offer help, but she hesitated. Ethan had a way of making examples of staff who overstepped their bounds, and Lila couldn't afford to lose this job. Evelyn, meanwhile, held her ground. Your standards, she said, her voice carrying just enough edge to hint at her growing impatience, must be quite high if they involve turning away paying customers without so much as a glance at your seating chart. Ethan's smile didn't waver, but his tone grew sharper. Look, ma'am, I'm trying to help you here. There are plenty of places nearby that might be more accommodating. Perhaps one of the diners on King Street? They're casual and, well, easier to get into. Evelyn met his gaze, her calm expression betraying none of the irritation simmering beneath the surface. That's very thoughtful of you, she said, her tone as measured as ever. But I think I'll wait here for a bit, just in case something opens up. Ethan's smile faltered for the briefest moment before he regained his composure. Suit yourself, he said curtly, already turning his attention to the next group of guests approaching the door. Evelyn stepped aside, taking a seat on a small bench near the entrance. She watched as Ethan greeted the next couple with exaggerated warmth, his demeanor entirely different from the one he had shown her. It was a stark contrast that didn't escape her notice. Before long, Lila passed by again, this time heading toward the kitchen. She stole a quick glance at Evelyn, her curiosity piqued. There was something about the older woman's composure that seemed out of place, something that hinted at a deeper story. After a few moments, Evelyn stood, brushing off her coat as if preparing to leave. She turned back to Ethan, who was now busy with the seating chart he hadn't bothered to consult earlier. I'll take your advice, Evelyn said, her voice carrying just enough weight to draw his attention. But I hope you'll remember, Mr. Myers, that appearances can be deceiving. Sometimes what you think you know isn't the whole story. Ethan looked up, his brow furrowing at her words. For a moment there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by his usual air of indifference. Have a good evening, he said dismissively. Evelyn gave him a faint smile before stepping out into the crisp night air. Inside, Lila paused by the doorway, watching as Evelyn disappeared into the bustling street. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last time they'd see her. Later that evening, driven by curiosity, Lila searched the staff handbook and found a list of key figures in the restaurant chain. Her breath caught when she saw the name Evelyn Harper, founder and CEO. The chill of the December evening clung to Evelyn as she made her way back to her modest townhouse on the quieter outskirts of Charleston. The festive lights strung across the streets did little to lift her spirits, their glow paling in comparison to the storm brewing in her chest. As the distant sound of bells from a church tower echoed through the air, Evelyn allowed herself a rare moment of vulnerability. She couldn't shake the condescending tone of Ethan Myers, the dismissive glance that had evaluated her worth in mere seconds. It wasn't the first time she'd faced such prejudice, but it never failed to sting. Memories of her youth surfaced unbidden. Growing up in the segregated South, Evelyn had learned early that appearances often dictated opportunities. She remembered the long hours her mother spent cleaning houses for wealthier families, the silent endurance etched into her hands. Evelyn's own journey had been no easier, navigating systemic barriers, enduring countless dismissals, and fighting to carve a space where dignity and respect weren't determined by the color of her skin or the cost of her clothes. Yet here she was, decades later, a woman of success and stature, still encountering the same tired judgments. Had she been too complacent, trusting that her values alone could safeguard the culture she'd worked so hard to build? The question gnawed at her as she unlocked her front door and stepped inside. The warmth of her living room greeted her, the scent of cedar from the small Christmas tree filling the space. Evelyn hung her coat by the door and settled into her desk chair, the light from her laptop screen casting a soft glow in the dim room. If she wanted answers, she'd have to dig for them herself. Pulling up the database of customer feedback from the Magnolia House, Evelyn began scrolling through months of comments. Her sharp eyes picked up on a troubling pattern: complaints of rude behavior, dismissive service, and even outright discrimination. But what stood out most was the lack of resolution. Each complaint had been marked as addressed, yet there was no record of follow-up actions. Her jaw tightened as she clicked through emails forwarded to the restaurant's management team. Many of them described situations not unlike her own experience that evening. Guests turned away for arbitrary reasons, staff visibly uncomfortable, and a general sense of exclusion for anyone not fitting the unspoken standard. And every time, the responses were curt and dismissive, signed by none other than Ethan Myers. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, a heavy sigh escaping her lips. This wasn't just a matter of poor management. It was a deliberate effort to maintain an image that stood in direct opposition to everything she believed in. She made a mental note to schedule a formal investigation, but knew that tonight's observations weren't enough. She needed more. Meanwhile, back at the Magnolia House, Ethan Myers continued to exert his brand of authority. The restaurant was bustling as usual, and Ethan moved through the dining room with the practiced air of someone who considered himself indispensable. A middle-aged couple entered the restaurant, their faces rosy from the cold. The man wore a wool coat, its edges slightly frayed, and the woman clutched a vintage handbag that bore the signs of years of use. They approached the podium with hopeful smiles, but Ethan's expression soured almost immediately. "Good evening," the man began. "We were hoping you might have a table for two?" Ethan glanced over their shoulders, his gaze landing on a group of better-dressed patrons waiting behind them. "I'm sorry, but we're fully booked," he said, his tone clipped. "Oh," the woman said, disappointment flashing across her face. "We thought we saw a few open tables." "They're reserved," Ethan interrupted, his smile thin and unyielding. "I'd suggest trying one of the casual spots down the block." The couple exchanged a glance before quietly leaving. Their excitement dimmed. From across the room, Lila Brooks watched the interaction unfold, her grip tightening on the tray she was carrying. It wasn't the first time she'd seen Ethan turn guests away for no valid reason, but tonight felt different. As Ethan turned to her, Lila quickly averted her gaze, pretending to focus on the table she was serving, but the unease lingered. "Lila," Ethan called out sharply, his voice cutting through the din of the restaurant. "You're not paid to stand around. Keep moving?" "Yes, sir," she murmured, her cheeks flushing. But as the night wore on, Lila couldn't shake the nagging feeling in her gut. The way Ethan spoke to that couple, and to Evelyn earlier, felt wrong. It wasn't just unprofessional, it was cruel, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could stand by without saying something. In a moment of impulsive courage, Lila slipped her phone from her pocket and discreetly began recording Ethan as he dealt with another guest. His condescension was on full display, his words cutting and dismissive. It wasn't much, but it was something. Later that night, after her shift ended, Lila sat in her car with the video queued up on her phone. Her finger hovered over the email draft addressed to the corporate office. She hesitated, torn between the fear of losing her job and the need to do what she felt was right. Across town, Evelyn's fingers hovered over her keyboard as she composed a memo outlining her findings. She wasn't sure how deep the issues ran, but one thing was clear. The Magnolia House was no longer living up to its name. The rhythmic hum of the restaurant's kitchen reverberated in the background as Lila Brooks stood by the service station, her fingers nervously adjusting the edge of her apron. She watched Ethan Myers glide across the dining room, his smile polished yet empty, his gaze sharp as ever. To most customers, he appeared every bit the charismatic manager, But to those who worked under him, he was something entirely different, a looming shadow that drained the warmth from every corner of the establishment. For Lila, the Magnolia House was supposed to be a stepping stone, a place where she could refine her skills and build a career in hospitality. She'd always loved the idea of creating experiences for people, of seeing them leave happier than when they arrived. But under Ethan's reign, that dream had grown dim. Lila was a junior at a local college, balancing classes during the day and shifts at the restaurant in the evenings. The paycheck barely covered her rent and tuition, but it was enough to keep her afloat. She had once imagined climbing the ranks here, maybe even becoming a manager herself one day. Yet now each shift felt like a minefield, with Ethan's temper flaring at the smallest perceived mistake. As she set a tray of glasses down on the counter, a soft voice behind her startled her. Rough night? It was Angela, a server in her 50s who had been at the restaurant longer than anyone else. Her kind eyes carried the weight of years spent weathering similar storms. Lila sighed, glancing over her shoulder to ensure Ethan wasn't within earshot. "Isn't it always?" she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Angela chuckled dryly. "You get used to it, or you don't, and you leave. That's what happened to Mia, remember?" Lila frowned. Mia had been a server who left abruptly a few months ago, though no one had ever explained why. "What happened with her?" Lila asked, leaning in slightly. Angela hesitated, glancing toward the dining room. She tried to report Ethan, told HR about how he treated staff, how he picked on certain guests. Next thing we knew, she was gone. Guess HR didn't like what they heard, or maybe Ethan just knows how to cover his tracks. The revelation made Lila's stomach churn. She had suspected Ethan's influence reached farther than it should, but hearing confirmation left her feeling trapped. "That's awful," she murmured. Angela placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Be careful, Lila. He's not someone you want to cross." As the night wore on, Lila couldn't shake Angela's words, or the memory of the couple Ethan had turned away earlier. Every interaction she had witnessed that evening added to the knot of frustration tightening in her chest. By the time her shift ended, she felt suffocated by the weight of her silence. In the break room, Lila retrieved her phone from her bag and scrolled through the video she had recorded of Ethan's behavior. Her thumb hovered over the send button, the email address she had found in the staff handbook already typed in. A generic feedback at harperrestaurants.com. It was listed as a resource for reporting workplace concerns, though she doubted it would actually reach anyone who cared. Still, she pressed send. Unbeknownst to Lila, that email landed directly in Evelyn Harper's inbox. Sitting at her desk, Evelyn opened the message, her brows knitting together as she watched the shaky video of Ethan berating a server and dismissing a guest. The smirk on his face, the sharpness in his tone, it confirmed everything she had suspected and more. Evelyn's grip on her pen tightened. This wasn't just poor management. It was a rot that threatened the very foundation of her business. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling deeply. The decision came swiftly. She needed to return to the Magnolia House, not as the woman Ethan had dismissed, but as someone who could quietly observe the inner workings of the restaurant and its people. That night, before shutting down her laptop, Evelyn typed out a short reply to Lila's email. "Thank you for your courage in sharing this. Stay strong. Someone will be there to help you soon." Lila read the email the following morning, her heart skipping a beat at the words. The sender's name was anonymous, but the message felt like a lifeline. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of hope pierced through her uncertainty. The Magnolia House hummed with the quiet sophistication of a busy weekend night. Evelyn Harper stepped through its grand entrance once more, this time dressed in a tailored navy coat and low-heeled leather boots. A string of pearls adorned her neck, and her sleek, understudded handbag was far from the worn leather one she carried during her previous visit. Everything about her demeanor spoke of quiet confidence, her presence polished yet intentionally unassuming. This time, she wasn't brushed off by the hostess. A polite young woman, who didn't recognize her from before, greeted Evelyn with a warm smile. "Good evening, ma'am. Do you have a reservation tonight?" "I don't," Evelyn said calmly, "but I was wondering if you might have an opening for one." "I don't mind waiting." The hostess hesitated, glancing at her seating chart. But before she could respond, Ethan Myers appeared, his sharp suit and calculated charm as polished as ever. His eyes briefly swept over Evelyn, taking in her updated appearance. For a moment, Ethan didn't seem to recognize her. The Evelyn he had dismissed just days earlier had been a nameless figure, someone he hadn't thought twice about. Tonight, however, her poised elegance placed her squarely in his acceptable category. "Good evening," Ethan greeted with his signature half-smile, his voice dripping with professional courtesy. "You're alone this evening, ma'am?" "I am," Evelyn replied. "It's been a long day, and I thought I'd treat myself." Ethan nodded approvingly, gesturing toward the dining room. "I believe we can accommodate you, if you'll follow me." As he led her through the restaurant, Evelyn took note of every detail. The pacing of the servers, the quiet tension in their interactions with Ethan, and the way his demeanor shifted depending on who he was addressing. She observed how he fawned over a table of well-dressed guests, his smile brighter and his words more effusive than they needed to be. Evelyn was seated at a corner table near the window, with a view of both the dining room and the bustling street outside. It was the perfect vantage point for her to watch and listen. A server approached with the menu and a practiced smile, offering her water and a wine list. Evelyn declined the wine but accepted a glass of sparkling water, her gaze never straying far from Ethan. Moments later, the door opened to a group of three young adults, their casual attire setting them apart from the restaurant's usual clientele. One of them, a woman in her 20s with a bright, infectious laugh, approached the podium. "Hi," she said cheerfully. "We were hoping to get a table for three." Ethan, who had been scanning the room, turned his attention to them. His smile faded as he took in their jeans and sneakers. "I'm sorry, Yashana," he said, his tone clipped. "We're fully booked tonight." The woman's face fell. "Oh, we didn't think to make a reservation, but it looks like there are a couple of empty tables." "They're reserved," Ethan interrupted, his voice firm. "This is a fine dining establishment, and we adhere to a strict reservation policy." Evelyn's gaze sharpened as she watched the exchange. The woman hesitated, clearly embarrassed, before nodding. "All right. Thank you anyway." As the group turned to leave, Ethan muttered under his breath, loud enough for Evelyn to hear. "This isn't a place for everyone." Evelyn placed her glass down with deliberate care, her fingers tightening briefly around its stem. Rising from her seat, she made her way toward the podium. Ethan glanced at her, momentarily startled by her approach. "Excuse me," Evelyn began, her voice measured but carrying an unmistakable edge. "I couldn't help but overhear. Is it standard practice for your staff to turn away guests based solely on appearance?" Ethan straightened, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, I don't believe this concerns you." "I disagree," Evelyn countered smoothly. "As someone dining here tonight, I'd say the integrity of this establishment's service very much concerns me. Those guests were polite, respectful, and clearly willing to pay. Yet you sent them away without even considering a solution. I'm curious, how exactly does that align with the values of the Magnolia House?" Ethan's eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation breaking through his polished facade. "With all due respect, you don't understand how a high-end restaurant operates. We have to maintain a certain atmosphere, and sometimes that means making difficult decisions about who we serve." Evelyn arched an eyebrow. "Is that so? And what criteria exactly are you using to make these decisions? Because from where I'm standing, it looks an awful lot like personal bias." Ethan's jaw tightened, his professional mask slipping further. "I don't think you're in a position to lecture me on how to manage my restaurant," he said, his voice low and strained. Evelyn allowed a small enigmatic smile to curve her lips. "Oh, I wouldn't presume to lecture you. I'm simply pointing out what's evident to anyone paying attention." She paused, her gaze locking with his. "But perhaps I do understand how this restaurant operates better than you think. You might want to prepare yourself for what's coming." Ethan blinked, momentarily caught off guard by her words. There was something unsettling in the calm certainty of her tone, something that lingered even as she turned and walked back to her table. For the rest of the evening, Ethan found himself glancing in her direction, the unease she had stirred refusing to settle. He didn't know who she was or why she had spoken to him that way, but he felt the faintest hint of doubt creeping in. Evelyn sat at her desk, the soft glow of her lamp casting long shadows across the room. The quiet hum of her neighborhood was in stark contrast to the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. She had spent the better part of the evening combing through reports and compiling notes, each detail painting a darker picture of the Magnolia House's operations under Ethan Myers. What she needed now were voices, first-hand accounts that would confirm what the data couldn't show. With this in mind, Evelyn had arranged to meet Lila Brooks after the young woman's shift. They had agreed on a small coffee shop just a few blocks from the restaurant. The space was cozy, with warm wooden furnishings and the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. Evelyn arrived first, settling into a booth near the back where they could speak freely. Lila entered shortly after, her shoulders slightly hunched as if bracing against more than just the cold evening air. Her eyes scanned the room nervously until they landed on Evelyn, whose calm, reassuring presence immediately seemed to put her at ease. "Thank you for meeting me," Evelyn said, offering a gentle smile as Lila slid into the seat across from her. "Of course," Lila replied, though her voice carried the hesitancy of someone unused to speaking freely. She folded her hands on the table, her fingers fidgeting slightly. Evelyn leaned forward, her tone encouraging. "You don't need to be nervous. I just want to understand what's really happening at the Magnolia House. I promise you, anything you share will stay between us." For a moment, Lila hesitated, weighing her words carefully. Then, as if a dam had broken, the stories began to spill out. "It's not just the way he treats the guests," Lila said, her voice trembling slightly. "He's cruel to the staff, too. If you make even the smallest mistake, he'll humiliate you in front of everyone. He's taken tips from servers to cover shortages, even when we know the register was balanced." She looked down at her hands, her frustration evident. "People are afraid of him. A few have tried to speak up, but they either get written up for something bogus or suddenly find their hours cut until they quit." Evelyn listened intently, her expression growing darker with every word. She had suspected Ethan's behavior extended beyond the guests, but hearing it confirmed with such clarity made her resolve even stronger. "I'm so sorry you've had to deal with this," Evelyn said softly. "You've shown a lot of courage just by coming here tonight. I need you to keep observing, documenting anything you can. This isn't just about fixing one restaurant. It's about ensuring this kind of behavior doesn't happen anywhere in my organization." Lila nodded, her expression a mix of relief and determination. "I'll do what I can," she said. Their conversation was winding down when the sound of the coffee shop's door opening caught Evelyn's attention. She glanced over Lila's shoulder and froze. Ethan Myers had just stepped in, his sharp gaze scanning the room. Evelyn quickly lowered her head, pretending to examine her phone, but it was too late. Ethan's eyes had already landed on their table. Though he made no immediate move to approach, Evelyn could feel the weight of his suspicion. She reached across the table, lightly touching Lila's hand. "Stay calm," she murmured. "We'll finish up here quickly." Ethan didn't linger, but his presence cast a heavy shadow over the remainder of their meeting. As he exited the shop, Evelyn could see the gears turning in his mind. The next morning, the consequences of his paranoia became evident. Lila arrived at the restaurant for her shift only to be summoned into Ethan's office before she could clock in. "I'm disappointed, Lila," Ethan began, his tone feigning disappointment. "It's come to my attention that there's a significant discrepancy in the accounts from last night. A large payment was entered but never finalized. Care to explain how that happened under your watch?" Lila's heart sank. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered. Ethan's expression hardened. "You're the only one who handled that table's payment. Either you fix this or—" He let the implication hang in the air, his meaning clear. By the time Lila emerged from the office, her hands were trembling. The accusation was baseless, but the threat was real. She knew how easily Ethan could manipulate the situation to make it appear legitimate. Evelyn, who had arrived at the restaurant unnoticed, saw Lila's pale face as she exited the office. She approached quietly, her voice low but firm. "Lila, take a deep breath," she said. "We're going to handle this." Evelyn knew she couldn't delay any longer. Ethan's behavior had escalated beyond mere poor management. It was outright malicious. She stepped outside, pulled out her phone, and made a call to the corporate compliance team. "Set up an audit for the Magnolia House," she instructed. "Effective immediately. I'll be overseeing it personally." She ended the call and turned back toward the restaurant, her expression resolute. Ethan Myers had underestimated her, but he was about to learn exactly who he was dealing with. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of the Magnolia House as the doors opened earlier than usual. Staff arriving for their shifts exchanged curious glances at the unfamiliar sight. A group of sharply dressed individuals, clipboards in hand, moving purposefully into the restaurant. Evelyn Harper followed closely behind, her expression calm but resolute. She wore a tailored blazer and carried a leather-bound notebook, projecting an air of quiet authority. Ethan Myers was already inside, his usual composure slipping the moment he spotted the group. His smile faltered before he approached Evelyn, the smooth-talking mask slipping over his features like a shield. "Good morning," Ethan greeted, forcing a tone of pleasant surprise. "I wasn't expecting a visit this early. What brings you and your team here today?" Evelyn smiled faintly, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Routine evaluation," she replied evenly. "I like to ensure everything in my restaurants is running as smoothly as possible. I trust you don't mind." "Of course not," Ethan said quickly, though his fingers tightened briefly around the pen he was holding. "We're always happy to show how well we operate." The team wasted no time getting to work, splitting into groups to audit different aspects of the restaurant's operations. Evelyn lingered in the background, her gaze keen as she observed Ethan's interactions with the staff. He moved around the dining room, issuing curt instructions to his employees, his tone growing sharper each time he addressed them. As the hours wore on, the mood in the restaurant grew increasingly tense. The evaluators began uncovering irregularities, small at first but increasingly troubling as their investigation deepened. One member of the team approached Evelyn, holding a folder filled with printouts. "We've found discrepancies in the financial records," she said quietly. "Several invoices appear to have been altered, and there's evidence of missing funds." Evelyn's expression didn't change, but her grip on the folder tightened. "Continue digging," she instructed. Another team member emerged shortly after, holding a tablet displaying the restaurant's internal reporting system. "Customer complaints," he explained. "A significant number have been deleted or marked as resolved without any supporting documentation." Evelyn nodded, her face betraying no emotion, though inside anger simmered. It wasn't just incompetence, it was deliberate manipulation. Ethan, who had been hovering nearby, noticed the evaluators conferring with Evelyn and approached, his smile strained. "Is there something I can help clarify?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of forced confidence. "We've noticed some inconsistencies in the reports," Evelyn said, her tone measured but pointed. "Would you care to explain why certain complaints appear to have been erased?" Ethan's eyes flickered briefly, a flash of panic quickly masked by indignation. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," he said, "but if there are any issues, I'm sure they're just clerical errors. We've been understaffed in admin recently, and things can slip through the cracks." "Understaffed?" Evelyn repeated, her voice soft but carrying an edge. "That's an interesting choice of words." As the evaluators continued their work, the picture became clearer. Ethan's attempts to cover his tracks only raised more questions. Each new discovery painted a damning portrait of a man who had been systematically exploiting his position. Amidst the unfolding chaos, Lila Brooks emerged from the kitchen, her eyes darting nervously as she noticed the scene. She hesitated before approaching Evelyn, who offered her a reassuring nod. With trembling hands, Lila handed over a flash drive. "This has everything I've collected," she whispered. "Emails, video clips, even some notes I took after staff meetings." Evelyn accepted the drive with a small smile. "You've done the right thing," she said softly. The evidence on the drive was damning. It included recordings of Ethan berating employees, emails in which he dismissed legitimate customer concerns as nonsense, and even logs showing unauthorized deductions from staff tips. When Ethan saw Evelyn and the evaluators reviewing the materials, his carefully constructed facade began to crack. He approached, his voice rising slightly. "What exactly is going on here? If you're going to accuse me of something, I deserve to know." Evelyn stood, her calm demeanor unshaken. "Accusations are unnecessary when the facts speak for themselves," she said, her voice steady. Ethan's jaw clenched, his gaze darting between Evelyn and the evaluators. "Who even are you?" he demanded, his tone edged with frustration. Evelyn met his eyes, her expression unreadable. "Let's just say I know this restaurant better than you think," she replied, "and I have no tolerance for people who betray its values." Her words hung in the air, a subtle yet undeniable declaration of authority. Ethan stepped back, momentarily at a loss for words. There was something about her presence, an undercurrent of power that made him uneasy. As the evaluators wrapped up their work, Evelyn addressed the staff, her voice carrying a note of finality. "Thank you all for your cooperation today. Moving forward, we'll be making some changes to ensure this restaurant upholds the standards it was built on." Ethan watched her leave, a sinking feeling settling in his chest. He didn't know who Evelyn Harper really was, but he had a growing suspicion that his carefully curated world was about to come crashing down. The Magnolia House was unusually quiet the morning after the audit, a stillness that seemed to creep into every corner of the restaurant. Staff gathered uneasily in the dining room, the air heavy with anticipation. Ethan Myers stood at the head of the room, his hands clasped behind his back and his jaw set in a tight line. His usual facade of charm was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating edge. "This is unacceptable," Ethan began, his voice sharp enough to cut through the uneasy murmurs. "The results of yesterday's audit were embarrassing. They reflect poorly on me, on this staff, and on this restaurant." He let the weight of his words hang in the air before continuing. "But let me make one thing clear. Any issues that were uncovered, any discrepancies, any so-called complaints, will not fall on me. They are the responsibility of each and every one of you." The room fell silent. The staff exchanged wary glances, unsure of what Ethan was implying. Lila Brooks sat at the edge of the group, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She could feel Ethan's gaze sweep over her, and her stomach knotted with dread. "Lila," Ethan said suddenly, his tone pointed. "A word, please." Lila hesitated before standing, every step toward Ethan feeling heavier than the last. He gestured for her to follow him into his office, closing the door behind them with a deliberate click. "You've been busy," Ethan said, leaning against his desk and fixing her with a piercing stare. "The audit team seemed awfully interested in you yesterday. Care to explain why?" Lila swallowed hard, keeping her voice steady. "I just answered their questions, sir. That's what they asked me to do." Ethan's smile was thin and humorless. "And what exactly did you tell them? Because I've been hearing things. Rumors about emails, videos, things that, if true, could be very damaging. Not just for me, but for you, too." Lila's breath caught in her throat. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said carefully. Ethan leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Let me make this simple. Whatever you said, or think you know, ends here. You're going to retract any statements you made to the audit team. And if you don't," he paused, his smile widening, "well, let's just say I'd hate for you to lose this job over a misunderstanding." Lila felt the weight of his threat settle on her, like a crushing force. She wanted to shout, to push back, but the fear of losing her job, and the means to pay for school, paralyzed her. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good," Ethan said, straightening and smoothing his tie. "I knew you'd see reason." Lila left the office with her heart pounding, her resolve shaken but not broken. She found Evelyn waiting for her near the entrance, her calm presence a much-needed anchor. "He's trying to scare you," Evelyn said quietly. "Don't let him." Lila nodded, drawing strength from Evelyn's unwavering confidence. "I won't," she said, her voice firmer now. Meanwhile, Evelyn was faced with her own decision. The audit had confirmed her worst suspicions, but it wasn't enough. Ethan's behavior was escalating, and she knew that as long as he remained in power, the restaurant and the people who worked there would suffer. Evelyn made her choice. That afternoon, she called an emergency meeting with the staff. "Effective immediately," she announced, her voice steady and clear. "The Magnolia House will close for a full day tomorrow. During that time, we will conduct a thorough investigation into our operations. This isn't a punishment. It's an opportunity to ensure we're living up to the standards this restaurant was built on." The staff exchanged stunned looks. A closure, even for a day, was unheard of. The financial loss would be significant, but Evelyn's tone left no room for debate. Ethan, however, was far from defeated. That evening, he began rallying his supporters among the staff, planting seeds of doubt about Evelyn's intentions. He framed her actions as reckless, a threat to their livelihoods. "She doesn't understand what it takes to run this place," he told one of his allies, a senior server who had long been loyal to him. "If we let her take over, we'll all be out of a job." By the next morning, the restaurant was a battleground of whispered alliances and simmering tensions. Lila, feeling increasingly isolated, found herself on the receiving end of glares and cold shoulders from some of her coworkers. But Evelyn remained resolute. Standing before the staff once more, she addressed the growing unease head-on. "I understand that change is hard," she began, "and I know some of you may feel uncertain about what's happening. But let me be clear, the decisions I'm making are not about punishing anyone. They're about protecting what this restaurant stands for: fairness, respect, and excellence." Her gaze swept across the room, landing briefly on Ethan, who stood near the back with his arms crossed and a defiant smirk on his face. "The truth will come out," Evelyn continued, her voice firm. "And when it does, those who have acted with integrity will have nothing to fear. But those who have betrayed this establishment's values—" She let the sentence trail off, her meaning unmistakable. Ethan's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of unease. He began to see Evelyn not as a meddlesome guest, but as a force to be reckoned with. The atmosphere in the Magnolia House's private meeting room was heavy, a palpable tension crackling between the gathered employees. Evelyn Harper stood at the head of the long wooden table, her hands resting lightly on its surface, her calm demeanor belying the storm raging inside her. She had called for this meeting to address the escalating issues, but it was clear from the wary glances and hushed murmurs among the staff that the room was already divided. Ethan Myers sat at the opposite end of the table, his arms crossed, a practiced smirk on his face. He exuded an air of confidence, as if he were untouchable. But Evelyn could see the slight twitch in his jaw, the flicker of unease he tried to hide. "Thank you all for being here," Evelyn began, her voice steady but firm. "I've called this meeting to address some serious concerns that have come to my attention regarding the operations and culture of this restaurant. It's important that we approach this with honesty and a commitment to improvement." Evelyn's words were met with a murmur of agreement from a few employees, but Ethan's sharp voice cut through the quiet. "With all due respect," he said, leaning forward in his chair, "I think it's important to remember that these so-called concerns are based on hearsay, and frankly, they're coming from people who have their own agendas." His words hung in the air, and Evelyn's gaze flicked briefly to Lila Brooks, who sat near the middle of the table. The young woman's face was pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Evelyn could sense her fear, but she also saw the glimmer of resolve in her eyes. "Lila," Evelyn said gently, motioning for her to speak, "would you mind sharing your perspective? I think it's important for everyone to hear directly from you." Lila hesitated, glancing nervously at Ethan, whose expression had hardened into a glare. Taking a deep breath, she stood, her voice trembling slightly as she began. "I've worked here for over a year," she said, her gaze shifting between her colleagues. "And in that time, I've seen things that don't feel right. Guests being turned away for reasons that don't make sense. Tips being taken from staff. And—" "Enough," Ethan snapped, rising from his chair. His voice was sharp, cutting off Lila mid-sentence. "This is exactly what I was talking about. People spreading lies to make themselves look better. Lila, you've been a problem since day one, and now you're trying to drag this restaurant down with you?" The room fell silent, the weight of Ethan's accusation hanging heavily in the air. Lila's face flushed with embarrassment, and for a moment she looked as though she might retreat. But Evelyn stepped in, her voice calm yet unyielding. "Ethan," she said, her gaze locking with his, "this is a professional discussion. Let's allow Lila to finish without interruption." Ethan scoffed but reluctantly sat back down, his expression seething. Lila hesitated before continuing, her voice steadier this time. "I'm not trying to drag anyone down," she said firmly. "I just want things to be fair, for the staff, for the guests, for everyone. And I'm not the only one who feels this way." Her words sparked a ripple of murmurs among the employees, some nodding in quiet agreement while others avoided her gaze, clearly torn between their own experiences and the fear of retaliation. Evelyn let the murmurs die down before speaking again. "Thank you, Lila. she said. Your courage is commendable. Turning her attention back to the group, Evelyn addressed the room as a whole. The concerns Lila has raised are not isolated incidents. Over the past week, I've been reviewing records, feedback, and other evidence that paints a troubling picture of what's been happening here. Ethan's voice broke in again, louder this time. This is a witch hunt, he declared, his tone dripping with indignation. You're taking the word of one disgruntled employee and using it to smear my reputation. Do you have any idea what this will do to the restaurant's image? To our careers? Evelyn didn't flinch. Instead, she reached for a folder on the table and opened it, pulling out several documents. Let's talk about image then, she said, her tone steady but sharp. Let's talk about the complaints that were deleted from the system, the invoices that were altered, the tips that went missing. Would you like to explain those, Ethan? Ethan's face darkened, but before he could respond, Evelyn added, or perhaps you'd like to explain why your name appears in an internal report from one of my other restaurants, one that describes behavior strikingly similar to what's been happening here. The room went deathly quiet. Ethan's expression faltered, his confidence finally cracking. You don't know what you're talking about, he stammered, though the panic in his voice betrayed him. Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about, Evelyn replied. You worked at another location under a different name, didn't you? After you were terminated for misconduct, you managed to get rehired here by falsifying your records. Ethan's jaw dropped, and for the first time he looked truly shaken. The room erupted into whispers, the staff exchanging shocked glances as the weight of Evelyn's revelation sank in. Evelyn straightened, her voice cutting through the chaos. I've given you every opportunity to correct your behavior, she said, her gaze fixed firmly on Ethan. But now it's clear that you have no intention of changing. So let me be clear. Your time here is over. Ethan stared at her, his disbelief quickly morphing into fury. You can't do this, he spat. You don't have the authority. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her voice calm but laced with steel. Oh, I assure you, I do. And you'll find out just how much authority I have very soon. The air in the Magnolia House was charged with an unusual tension as the staff gathered in the main dining area. Chairs had been pulled away from tables to make room, and the usually elegant atmosphere now felt heavy with anticipation and uncertainty. Evelyn Harper stood at the head of the room, her presence calm yet commanding. Dressed in a sharp black blazer, she held a slim folder in her hands, its contents meticulously organized. The employees, a mix of servers, kitchen staff, and management, murmured quietly among themselves. Ethan Myers stood near the back, his arms crossed, his gaze sharp and calculating. He had no idea why this meeting had been called, but he was already preparing his defenses. Evelyn waited for the room to settle, her silence demanding attention more effectively than any words could. When the whispers finally faded, she stepped forward and addressed the group. Good afternoon, she began, her voice steady and clear. I've called this meeting because it's time for transparency. Over the past several weeks, I've been observing the operations of this restaurant. What I've seen and learned has raised serious concerns, not just about how this place is being managed, but about whether it still reflects the values it was built on. Her words hung in the air, a quiet ripple of unease spreading through the room. Ethan smirked, his arms tightening across his chest. With all due respect, he interjected, his tone laced with sarcasm, I think we all know where this is going. More baseless accusations, right? Maybe another round of audits? Evelyn turned her gaze to him, her expression unreadable. She allowed a brief pause before speaking. I think it's time we stopped pretending, she said, her voice cutting through the room like a knife. I am not just an observer here. My name is Evelyn Harper. I am the founder and owner of this restaurant, of this entire chain. The room fell utterly silent. A collective gasp rippled through the staff, and all eyes turned to Ethan, whose smirk evaporated instantly. His face froze in a mixture of disbelief and panic, his usual confidence cracking under the weight of her revelation. Evelyn continued, her voice unwavering. I've been watching closely because I care deeply about what this restaurant represents. I built this business to be a place of fairness, excellence, and respect. Values that I see being undermined. Ethan's mouth opened and closed as he tried to formulate a response. Finally, he managed to stammer. This, this has to be a misunderstanding. Whatever complaints you've heard, they've been exaggerated. I can explain. I'm not interested in excuses, Evelyn interrupted, her tone firm but calm. She reached into her folder and began laying out documents on the table in front of her. What I'm interested in are facts, and the facts are clear. One by one, she presented the evidence. Financial discrepancies showing misappropriated funds, emails dismissing customer complaints, and video footage documenting Ethan's behavior toward both staff and guests. Each piece was damning, painting a picture of systematic misconduct that could no longer be ignored. Ethan's composure crumbled further with every revelation. "This is a setup," he blurted out, his voice rising in desperation. "You can't seriously believe this nonsense. These are lies fabricated to discredit me." "Enough," Evelyn said, her voice sharp and commanding. "The evidence speaks for itself, and your behavior here today only confirms what I've suspected all along." Ethan's gaze darted around the room, searching for allies among the staff. A few employees shifted uncomfortably, but most avoided his eyes, their expressions filled with doubt and unease. It was Lila Brooks who finally broke the silence. She stood, her hands trembling slightly but her voice steady. "I can confirm everything Mrs. Harper has said," she began. "I've seen it firsthand. The way Ethan has treated people, the lies, the intimidation, it's all true." Her words carried a weight that no document or video could match. The sincerity in her voice resonated with the staff, many of whom began nodding in agreement. Lila continued, her confidence growing with each word. "I stayed silent for too long because I was scared, but Mrs. Harper gave me the courage to speak up. And I think we all need to ask ourselves, is this the kind of place we want to work in? Is this the kind of person we want to follow?" The room erupted in murmurs once again, but this time the tone had shifted. The staff began exchanging stories, small admissions of their own experiences under Ethan's rule. The tide was turning, and Ethan could feel it slipping out of his control. Evelyn stepped forward once more, her presence anchoring the room. "Today marks a turning point," she said. "We're not just addressing the issues here. We're redefining the values this restaurant stands for. Anyone unwilling to uphold those values has no place here." She turned her gaze to Ethan, her expression resolute. "That includes you." Ethan stared at her, his face pale and his eyes filled with fury. "You'll regret this," he spat. "You think you've won, but you don't know what you're dealing with." Evelyn held his gaze unflinching. "Perhaps, but I do know this. Your time here is over." Ethan stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was also filled with a sense of relief, a weight that had been lifted. Evelyn turned back to the staff, her voice softer now but no less firm. "We have work to do," she said, "but I believe in this team. Together we can rebuild and make this place better than ever." The staff nodded, their expressions a mix of determination and newfound hope. The Magnolia House felt like it had a future worth fighting for. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the Magnolia House did little to lift the heavy tension that hung in the air. Evelyn Harper stood at the center of the dining room, her sharp eyes scanning the faces of her staff. The previous day's revelations had shaken the restaurant to its core, and now the time had come to make her decision. With a folder of damning evidence in hand, Evelyn exuded an aura of unshakable authority. Her calm demeanor silenced the murmurs among the staff, all of whom were waiting anxiously for what she would say next. Ethan Myers, however, stood near the back, his expression a mix of feigned indifference and barely concealed unease. "I've reviewed everything," Evelyn began, her voice steady and clear. "The evidence we've uncovered paints a troubling picture, one that cannot be ignored. The behavior and decisions that have taken place under this roof are unacceptable and go against every value this restaurant was founded on." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room, before settling firmly on Ethan. "Effective immediately, Ethan Myers is suspended from his position as manager of the Magnolia House, pending a full investigation into his actions." Gas rippled through the room. Ethan's face flushed with disbelief and fury. "This is outrageous," he spat, stepping forward. You can't just suspend me. I've dedicated years to this place, more than any of these people. And you think you can waltz in here and destroy everything I've built? Evelyn didn't flinch. Her eyes locked with Ethan's, calm but unyielding. You haven't built anything, Ethan, she replied. You've exploited this place and its people for your own gain, and now you will answer for it. Ethan's hands clenched into fists at his sides. You think it's that simple? That you can just remove me and everything will go back to normal? I have connections, people who won't let you ruin my reputation without a fight. Evelyn's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. Do you really believe I didn't anticipate this? She said, her tone cutting. Everything has been documented. Every transaction, every complaint, every email. The truth will speak for itself, and your so-called connections won't change that. Ethan's defiance faltered, replaced by a flicker of desperation. You're making a mistake, he hissed. I won't go down without a fight. That's your choice, Evelyn replied coolly. But I assure you, it won't change the outcome. The weight of her words settled over the room, and Ethan realized he had no immediate way out. With a sharp glare, he stormed out of the dining room, slamming the door behind him. The staff stood in stunned silence, their emotions a mix of relief and uncertainty. For some, Ethan's departure felt like a long overdue justice. For others, it was a jarring shift in the balance of power. Evelyn turned her attention back to the group. I know this is a lot to take in, she said, her voice softer now. But this isn't the end. It's a new beginning. Together, we can rebuild trust and create a workplace that reflects the values we all deserve. Lila Brooks, standing near the front, felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She could breathe freely, the weight of Ethan's intimidation finally lifting. She met Evelyn's gaze and gave a small, grateful nod. Evelyn smiled faintly in return, but her mind was already racing. She knew Ethan wouldn't back down quietly. His defiance wasn't a sign of strength, it was a warning. Later that evening, Evelyn received a call from her internal investigations team. We've uncovered something, the voice on the other end said, their tone cautious. It looks like Ethan may have falsified financial records to cover up a significant loss of funds. Evelyn's grip on the phone tightened. How much are we talking about? Enough to cause major problems if it gets out, the investigator replied, but we're still piecing it together. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, the weight of the situation settling heavily on her shoulders. Keep digging, she instructed. I want every detail, no matter how small. As she hung up, Evelyn stared out the window of her office, the city lights twinkling in the distance. Ethan's recklessness had left a trail, and now it was only a matter of time before everything came to light. She knew this was the final piece of the puzzle, the leverage she needed to ensure Ethan could never return to the Magnolia House or any other establishment under her name. The tension was palpable as Ethan Myers stormed into the Magnolia House, the sharp click of his polished shoes echoing through the quiet dining room. Staff froze mid-task, their faces a mixture of shock and apprehension. They had all seen the announcement of Ethan's suspension just a day earlier, but now here he was, defiant and uninvited. Evelyn Harper stood near the bar, reviewing notes with Lila Brooks and a few senior staff members. The moment she saw Ethan, she straightened, her calm expression never wavering. The room seemed to shrink as Ethan's voice cut through the air. So this is how you operate? He began, his tone loud and laced with venom. You walk in here like some kind of savior, throwing around accusations, tearing down everything I've worked for. Do you have any idea what you're doing to this restaurant? Evelyn set her papers aside and turned to face him fully. Her voice, though quieter, carried an authority that silenced the room. Ethan, you were suspended, she said. You have no business being here right now. Oh, don't give me that, Ethan snapped, stepping closer. You're the one who's out of line. You think you can just waltz in here, make yourself the hero, and destroy my career? I've kept this place running for years. If anything, I'm the reason it's still standing. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, their loyalties split. Some nodded slightly at Ethan's words, while others looked to Evelyn, their trust in her growing after recent events. Evelyn's gaze remained steady. You've kept this place running? She repeated, her tone edged with disbelief. Ethan, what you've done is undermine everything this restaurant stands for. You've mistreated employees, disrespected customers, and abused your position for personal gain. That's not leadership. It's exploitation. Ethan laughed bitterly. Exploitation? That's rich coming from you. You don't know the first thing about what it takes to manage a place like this. All your idealism won't keep the lights on. Evelyn took a step forward, her calm demeanor unshaken. Idealism, she said. This restaurant was built on the belief that excellence and integrity go hand in hand. It thrived because people trusted it, trusted us. You've turned that trust into something transactional, and it stops now. Ethan's face twisted with anger. You think you're untouchable, don't you? He spat. Well, I've got news for you. I know things. Things that could ruin you. How do you think your precious customers would feel if I shared some of those little secrets? Like those emails from your VIP clients. You don't want me to make those public. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Even Lila stiffened, her eyes darting nervously between Ethan and Evelyn. But Evelyn didn't flinch. Her expression hardened, her voice as sharp as steel. Go ahead, Ethan, she said. Try it. Because I've already sent everything, every piece of evidence, every complaint, every falsified document, to the legal team and the authorities. Whatever you think you're holding over me pales in comparison to what I have on you. Ethan's smirk faltered, the weight of her words sinking in. His bravado cracked, and he looked genuinely uncertain. You wouldn't, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Oh, I would, Evelyn replied. And I did. This isn't about me, Ethan. This is about the people you've hurt and the damage you've done. You think you can manipulate your way out of this, but every move you've made has been documented. There's nowhere left for you to run. The room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Ethan looked around, his eyes scanning the faces of the staff, searching for support. But all he found were wary expressions, the cracks in his once solid authority now fully exposed. Finally, Evelyn motioned to the two security guards standing by the door. Please escort Mr. Myers out, she said. As the guards approached, Ethan stiffened, his fists clenched at his sides. This isn't over, he snarled, his voice low and menacing. You'll regret this. Mark my words. You'll pay for this. Evelyn met his glare with unwavering resolve. Perhaps, she said, but not today. The guards led Ethan out of the restaurant, his threats echoing faintly as the door swung shut behind him. The staff stood in a stunned silence, the gravity of what they had just witnessed sinking in. Evelyn turned back to the group, her voice calm but resolute. This isn't the end, she said. It's the beginning of something better. Together, we're going to rebuild this restaurant into a place we can all be proud of. Lila felt a surge of relief and determination, the weight of the past weeks finally lifting. She glanced at Evelyn, her trust in the woman now unshakable. Evelyn looked around the room, her gaze steady and full of quiet strength. Let's get to work, she said. The morning was crisp and clear, but the atmosphere within the Magnolia House's offices was anything but calm. Evelyn Harper sat at the head of the conference table, flanked by her legal team and a few senior staff members. A pile of printed news articles sat in front of her, their headlines bold and inflammatory. Restaurant mogul accused of biased practices and Evelyn Harper's empire built on double standards? Evelyn scanned the articles with a calm exterior, but the storm of emotions beneath the surface was undeniable. Ethan Myers had wasted no time launching his revenge, feeding a local tabloid reporter a slew of lies designed to discredit her and the values she had worked tirelessly to uphold. The accusations were as baseless as they were damaging, yet the public's appetite for scandal had given them traction. This is his last desperate attempt, Evelyn said firmly, addressing the room. But that doesn't mean we can ignore it. Perception matters, and we need to respond decisively. One of her lawyers leaned forward. We've been reviewing the allegations. They're clearly fabricated, but Ethan has been clever about mixing in just enough half-truths to make them sound credible. The claims about financial misconduct could cause real damage if we don't handle this carefully. Evelyn nodded, her mind already racing. What about the stolen documents? She asked. The lawyer hesitated before replying. We've confirmed that Ethan retained copies of falsified financial records, likely as leverage. If those are released to the public without context, They could create a narrative we can't easily control. The room fell silent, the weight of the situation pressing down on everyone. It was Lila Brooks who finally broke the quiet. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "If I hadn't shared what I did, maybe this wouldn't have escalated like this." Evelyn turned to her, her expression softening. "Lila, don't blame yourself," she said gently. "Ethan's actions are his responsibility, not yours. And what you did took courage. It's what allowed us to expose the truth in the first place." Lila hesitated, then nodded, her resolve strengthening. "Then let me help," she said. "There has to be something I can do." Evelyn considered this for a moment before making her decision. "You've already done more than enough, Lila," she said. "But if you're willing, I'd like you to join me at the press conference we're organizing. Your voice, your story, it matters. People need to hear the truth from someone who's lived it." Lila's eyes widened, but she nodded firmly. "I'll do it," she said. The team spent the next few hours finalizing the details of the press conference. Evelyn knew this was a gamble. Putting everything out in the open would either restore the public's trust or deepen the damage. But she had no intention of letting Ethan's lies define her legacy. On the day of the press conference, the venue was packed with reporters, cameras, and curious onlookers. Evelyn stood behind the podium, her presence commanding as she faced the crowd. Beside her, Lila stood nervously, clutching a small stack of notes. "Thank you all for being here today," Evelyn began, her voice steady and clear. "I've built my career and my life on the principles of fairness, integrity, and excellence. Recent accusations have called those values into question, and while they are entirely unfounded, I believe it's my responsibility to address them directly." She paused, letting her words settle before continuing. "Over the past few weeks, we've uncovered significant misconduct within our organization. Misconduct perpetrated by an individual who was entrusted with a position of leadership. While this individual has attempted to deflect blame and tarnish my reputation, the facts are clear, and today, we're here to present them." Evelyn stepped aside, motioning for Lila to take the microphone. The young woman hesitated briefly before stepping forward, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger with each word. "My name is Lila Brooks," she began. "I've worked at the Magnolia House for over a year, and during that time, I've seen both the best and worst of what this restaurant represents. Under Ethan Myers' management, I experienced intimidation, unfair treatment, and a culture of fear. But through it all, Mrs. Harper has shown me what true leadership looks like. Leadership that prioritizes people over power and values over profit." Lila's testimony was met with murmurs of approval from the crowd, and Evelyn stepped forward once more. "I want to be clear," she said. "We are committed to full transparency. Every document, every complaint, every decision will be made available for review. This isn't just about defending my name. It's about ensuring that our organization lives up to the standards we promise our customers and employees." As she concluded, a commotion erupted at the back of the room. All eyes turned as Ethan Myers appeared, his face twisted with fury. He pushed through the crowd shouting, "This is a sham! You think you can get rid of me and sweep everything under the rug?" Security quickly moved to intercept him, but Evelyn raised a hand, signaling them to stop. She faced Ethan directly, her expression calm but unyielding. "Ethan," she said, her voice steady, "you've had every opportunity to take responsibility for your actions. Instead, you've chosen to lash out and cause harm. This is the end of the road for you." Ethan's face darkened. "You think this is over," he sneered. "You'll regret this, Evelyn. I'll make sure of it." Evelyn met his gaze without flinching. "You've already lost, Ethan," she said simply. Security escorted him out, and as the doors closed behind him, the room erupted into questions from the press. Evelyn turned back to the crowd, her voice firm as she spoke her final words. "This isn't the end of our story," she said. "It's the beginning of a new chapter, one defined by the values that brought us here in the first place. Thank you." The room broke into applause, and Evelyn felt a wave of relief wash over her. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned. The press conference was held in the grand ballroom of a nearby hotel, a space large enough to accommodate the dozens of reporters, cameras, and curious onlookers who had gathered. Evelyn Harper stood at the podium, her posture confident and composed. Behind her, a large screen displayed the logo of the Magnolia House, a symbol of the values she was determined to defend. The room was abuzz with anticipation as Evelyn adjusted the microphone. The events of the past weeks had drawn widespread attention, and the media was eager to hear how she would respond to the scandal Ethan Myers had attempted to ignite. "Thank you all for coming," Evelyn began, her voice calm but firm. "Today I stand before you not to defend my reputation, but to reaffirm the values that the Magnolia House was built upon: fairness, integrity, and excellence. These values are not just words, they are the foundation of everything we do." She paused, letting her words resonate before continuing. "Recently, serious allegations have been made against this organization and against me personally. These claims are not only baseless, but were designed to distract from the real issue: the actions of a former employee who abused his position of power." Evelyn clicked a button on the podium, and the screen behind her came to life, displaying a series of documents. "Over the past month, we've conducted a thorough investigation," she explained. "What we've uncovered is deeply troubling. Financial records altered to hide theft, emails dismissing legitimate complaints from employees and customers, and video evidence of unacceptable behavior toward both staff and guests." The audience murmured as Evelyn clicked through the evidence. Each slide painted a damning picture of Ethan's misconduct, leaving no room for doubt. As Evelyn prepared to continue, the sound of the ballroom doors swinging open drew everyone's attention. Ethan Myers strode in, his expression a mixture of defiance and desperation. The room fell silent as he marched toward the stage, his voice rising above the whispers. "This is a farce," he shouted, pointing accusingly at Evelyn. "You're using me as a scapegoat to cover up your own failures. You're not a hero. You're a tyrant, hiding behind your so-called values while you ruin lives." Evelyn remained composed, her gaze steady as Ethan climbed the stage and stood a few feet from her. "Ethan," she said calmly, her voice cutting through his rant, "this is neither the time nor the place for theatrics. The evidence speaks for itself." But Ethan was undeterred. "You think this is over?" he sneered. "I have documents, real documents, that prove you've been hiding things. And if you think I won't release them, you're sorely mistaken." The room buzzed with tension, reporters furiously scribbling notes and snapping photos. Evelyn didn't waver. Instead, she reached into a folder on the podium and pulled out a sealed envelope. "Is this what you're referring to?" she asked, holding the envelope aloft. "Because if it is, let me save you the trouble." She opened the envelope, pulling out a printed email chain and a signed document. "This," she said, "is proof that Ethan Myers used a falsified identity to secure his position at the Magnolia House. It also details how he manipulated the financial system to funnel money into personal accounts." Evelyn handed the documents to her legal counsel, who distributed copies to the reporters in attendance. "These documents have been verified by our legal team and shared with the appropriate authorities," she continued. "Ethan Myers has not only violated the trust of this organization, but has committed serious criminal acts." Ethan's face turned pale, his confidence crumbling as the gravity of Evelyn's words sank in. Before he could respond, two uniformed police officers entered the room, making their way toward the stage. "Ethan Myers," one of them announced, "you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and identity theft. Please step down." The room erupted in flashes from cameras as the officers cuffed Ethan and began leading him away. He twisted to glare at Evelyn, his voice dripping with venom. "You've won this round," he spat, "but don't think you've beaten me for good. No one stays on top forever." Evelyn met his gaze without flinching. Her voice was steady, her words deliberate. "I don't need to stay on top, Ethan. I only need to ensure justice is served." The doors closed behind Ethan, leaving the room buzzing with the fallout of the dramatic turn of events. Evelyn turned back to the audience, her voice softer but no less resolute. "This is not the end of the Magnolia House," she said. "It's the beginning of a new chapter, one where transparency and accountability guide every decision we make. To our customers, our employees, and our partners, I promise you, we will emerge stronger." The room erupted in applause, and Evelyn felt the weight on her shoulders begin to lift. Lila, standing at the side of the stage, gave her a small but heartfelt smile. Evelyn returned the gesture, her mind already focused on the work ahead. Ethan's chapter in this story was over, but hers and the Magnolia House's was just beginning. The warm hues of the setting sun streamed through the windows of Evelyn Harper's office, casting long shadows across the room. She sat at her desk, the events of the past weeks replaying in her mind like a vivid montage. The dramatic press conference, Ethan's public meltdown, and his eventual arrest, all of it had led to this moment of clarity and quiet. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, letting her gaze drift to the framed photographs on the wall. One was of her as a young woman, standing beside her mother in their modest kitchen, both smiling despite the struggles of their lives. Another showed her at the grand opening of the first Magnolia House, surrounded by friends and family who had supported her dream. She closed her eyes and exhaled deeply. The journey had been anything but easy. Growing up in a working-class household in Charleston, she had learned early on that nothing would be handed to her. The world often judged her for her background, her race, or her gender, but she had refused to let those barriers define her. Evelyn thought about how far she'd come, not just in building her business, but in creating a space where people could feel valued, respected, and welcomed. Ethan's betrayal had threatened to undermine everything she had worked so hard for, but she realized now that his actions had also reminded her of the importance of vigilance and integrity. With a renewed sense of purpose, Evelyn reached for her notebook and began jotting down ideas. The system wasn't perfect, but it could be improved. She envisioned more frequent staff evaluations, anonymous feedback systems, and a stronger emphasis on leadership training. The events of the past few weeks had revealed cracks in her organization's foundation, and she was determined to address them head-on. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of Ethan's downfall were already being felt throughout the restaurant. The staff, once divided and wary, now worked with a newfound sense of pride and camaraderie. The toxic atmosphere Ethan had created was dissipating, replaced by an environment that fostered collaboration and mutual respect. One of the most notable changes was in Lila Brooks. The young woman had proven her mettle during the crisis, standing up for what was right despite the risks. Her courage hadn't gone unnoticed by Evelyn, who had personally offered her a promotion to management trainee. "You've earned this," Evelyn had told her during a quiet moment in the office. "Not just because of what you did, but because of who you are. I see great things in your future, Lila." Lila had accepted the promotion with tearful gratitude, her confidence growing with each passing day. She quickly became a role model for her peers, demonstrating that honesty and perseverance could overcome even the most challenging obstacles. Beyond the walls of the Magnolia House, the public's perception of Evelyn began to shift as well. The scandal Ethan had tried to ignite had backfired spectacularly, turning into a testament to Evelyn's integrity and leadership. Articles praising her resilience and ethical business practices began to circulate, drowning out the initial wave of negativity. "Harper stands tall amid scandal," one headline read. "A beacon of integrity in business," declared another. Customers who had once doubted the restaurant's values returned in droves, their loyalty strengthened by Evelyn's transparency. Even some of the chain's most prominent partners, who had hesitated during the controversy, renewed their contracts with enthusiasm. Ethan, meanwhile, faced the full weight of the law. The charges against him, fraud, embezzlement, and identity theft, were enough to ensure that his career in the restaurant industry was over. Investigators continued to uncover the extent of his wrongdoing, revealing a pattern of deceit that spanned years. His attempts to sabotage Evelyn had only served to seal his fate. As the days turned into weeks, the chaos that had once consumed the Magnolia House began to settle. Evelyn called a meeting with her management team to discuss the path forward. Standing at the head of the table, she outlined her vision for the future. A renewed commitment to the values that had made the Magnolia House a success in the first place. "We're not just rebuilding," she told them. "We're setting a new standard, one that will ensure this organization remains a place of fairness, excellence, and respect for generations to come." The team responded with enthusiasm, their faith in Evelyn's leadership stronger than ever. Evelyn felt a sense of peace. The battle had been hard fought, but it had also been worth it. That evening, as the streets of Charleston buzzed with life below, Evelyn stood by the window of her office, watching the ebb and flow of people. The city she loved had tested her, but it had also shaped her into the woman she had become. "This victory isn't mine," she said softly to herself, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. "It belongs to everyone who believes in justice, fairness, and the power of doing what's right." With that, Evelyn turned off the lights in her office, her heart lighter than it had been in months. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she allowed herself to savor the triumph, not just over Ethan, but over the doubt and fear that had once threatened to consume her. The streets of Charleston bustled as Evelyn Harper locked her office door, the brass nameplate reading, "Evelyn Harper, Founder." For the first time in years, the weight of daily responsibility felt lighter. Inside, her desk was empty, except for a plain envelope she'd opened earlier. The note inside was brief. "Thank you for doing the right thing, but not everyone agrees with your methods. This isn't over." Evelyn had smiled, not with fear, but with resolve. She knew the fight for fairness was never truly over. Glancing at the photos lining her walls, she reflected on the journey that had shaped the Magnolia House, the struggles, triumphs, and sacrifices that had built more than a business. It had built a legacy. Now she was stepping back, trusting the new generation of leaders she had mentored. Lila Brooks, thriving as a manager in training, reminded Evelyn of herself, determined and principled. One afternoon, Lila had asked, "How do I make sure I don't lose sight of what matters?" Evelyn had replied with quiet wisdom, "You listen to your team, your instincts, and your values." Leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about staying true to what's right. As Evelyn stepped onto Charleston's vibrant holiday streets, the twinkling lights and lively chatter filled the air. She thought of everyone who had shaped her journey, employees, supporters, even adversaries, and felt gratitude. The world would always have those who resisted fairness, but as long as someone stood for it, change was possible. Blending into the crowd, Evelyn carried with her the quiet confidence of a story that had made a difference, the lights of Charleston glowing as a reminder. Even in the darkest times, a spark of hope could shine. And so, Evelyn Harper's journey reminds us of a powerful truth. Standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. In a world full of challenges and betrayals, integrity and resilience can light the path forward, not just for ourselves, but for those who walk alongside us. What would you do to protect your values when they're under fire? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, justice, and the fight for what truly matters.